All right, thanks everyone for joining us today for today's ADRIA Research Skills webinar. My name is James Petty. I'm a project officer at VADA and the lead on the Alcohol and Drug Research Innovation or Agenda or ADRIA project. I have come down with a cough, so I am working from home and my voice sounds a little husky. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the varied lands on which we're meeting today. So I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge their ongoing connection to land, waters, and culture. Sovereignty of this land was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As we're meeting on varied lands today, I'd like to extend that respect to the elders of the lands from which others are joining us. Pardon me. Before we kick off and I introduce Paul, I did just want to note, or announce rather, that we have extended the deadline for the EOIs. So the original deadline for EOI submission was November 3rd. So that's next Friday. We have extended it by 2 weeks. So it is now close of business on Friday, November 17th. So you can put that in your diaries and get an extra couple of weeks to prepare your EOIs. I am in the process of updating the website. The website doesn't quite have that information on it yet, but it will have it up there by tomorrow. So today's webinar covers the grant application writing process, and we are once again joined by Dr. Paul Kellner. Dr. Kellner is a research fellow and associate director of the evidence review service at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and is a very good friend of ADRIA because he's been delivering these research capacity building webinars this year, and as well as delivering some last year. So before I start coughing again, I'm just going to hand straight over to Paul. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, James, and glad to be back. Always, always good to be talking with you all, and keen to share some thoughts on this topic, which I spend a lot of time doing grant writing. So let's see here. Let me get everything going. I'm always a little technologically illiterate. Let's see here. And all good. There we go.
Yeah, looks great.
So, like James said, I'm Paul, research fellow and associate director of evidence review service. I'll talk about where I work in just a moment. But before I do, I'll just quickly give you an overview of what we're going to talk about. I'll apologize to those who may have attended last year's session on this, and that much of the information will be the same. However, I will emphasize that I find it personally very useful to even prepare this presentation, because it's usually really good to remind myself of the fundamentals of what I know good practice is, and then what actually happens sometimes in the process. And so today I want to talk about first, why you're applying for this grant in particular. Second, eligibility criteria and feasibility discussions. Third, assessment criteria. Then excuse me, planning and implementing the writing process. And then some sort of smaller discussions on seeking support and collaboration, budgeting, and thinking about your audience. And so, although some of the comments will be targeted towards the ADRIA program and VADA, this is really meant to be a broader spanning conversation about grant writing in general. And then I'll zoom in occasionally on sort of ADRIA specific thoughts. But I will emphasize that any ADRIA questions should be sent to James and the VADA team, because I do not know all that much other than what's available to you all as well. So where I work in something called the Evidence Review Service at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. And we specialize in desktop reviews, often responding to sort of real-time policymaker or program needs about sort of evidence to support a decision or an action. So, if you need to design a new program, if you're planning a policy, what's the evidence that can back it up, and how can we obtain it quickly from, say, peer-reviewed literature? So that's at the core of what we do. But oftentimes we supplement that with qualitative processes, sometimes speaking to experts, whether that's senior level administrators in a field, or whether that's people with lots of lived experience, and we provide context and supplement for those desktop reviews. And then we also do a lot of prioritization work. So working with organizations to decide what's most important to them in terms of policy or in terms of research agenda. And then lastly, teaching and training type things like this. And who am I? I'm Paul, as I've already said. I guess I said this in the last session, but maybe one of the reasons that I might be an okay person to be talking about this topic is just that I've worked with or for a lot of different sectors. So we've got that list there. So governments, nonprofits, think tanks, corporates, universities. And in those experiences, I've done a lot of grant writing, especially a lot of collaborative grant writing. And I've also sat on the other side of things from time to time. So I've been a person who's been putting out calls for proposals and assessed those calls for proposals. So, but of course, my comments are my own and subjective in nature. And so they're not the be all and end all on these topics. They're just ideas to get your gears turning, as they say. So first and most importantly, why are you applying for this grant is a really important question to answer for yourself. Because grants take significant time and coordination oftentimes to write. So asking yourself, is this grant right for you? How well do your needs or interests or values align with the opportunity? And asking yourself, do you need to fundamentally change something about an idea you have to make it suit the opportunity? Because if so, it may not be the right opportunity for you. And so asking questions like, what's your likelihood of success? How does this grant fit into a bigger picture? Can be really important to ask right at the outset. So for instance, that bigger picture question is one that I find really useful because sometimes you can see very clearly where a grant fits into your programmatic ambitions over a longer period. You can say, oh, this is right for a pilot program, or this is right to kind of be a force multiplier for this other thing that we're running. So thinking about, is this the right grant to supplement this bigger picture that you have in mind? Another question that you might want to ask yourself right at the outset is, do you have the needed knowledge or skills, or do you have networks that have that knowledge and skills? So another thing to consider. And then also maybe the most critical one that I find is just, can you articulate your reason for applying? You know, is there a clearly defined, good, justifiable reason for why you think you want to put in the effort to apply for this grant? And there's a lot of reasons that you could have, but figuring out if you have one is an important thing to ask yourself before you do all the effort of writing a grant. And so if you think a grant might be right for you, and you think you have a good reason to apply for this particular grant, then you want to dig into your eligibility criteria and start thinking about feasibility before you do anything else. And so asking first, are we eligible to do this in the first place? Because if you're not eligible, there's no need to do the additional steps, unfortunately. However, there is something to note there. It's always good to share opportunities with people who might be eligible, because you never know when, you know, a colleague who gets that grant because you referred them to it might want to share a similar opportunity that you're eligible for in the future, or might want to collaborate, or might want to share the findings with you. And so even if you're not eligible, there's still things you can do with grant opportunities that come across your desk. But when you're thinking about eligibility criteria, there are specific eligibility criteria that we'll mention in a moment for ADRIA. But oftentimes I find that key areas to consider, so when you're looking through program documentation, you want to be looking at questions about organizational status, because especially with government grants or international large entities, they might require a certain type of organization. They might need you to have an ABN. They might need you to be registered in a particular state. You need to kind of figure out whether or not your organization or you as an individual can apply. Another thing that is becoming increasingly common is actually requiring partnerships of some kind as a part of grants. And so checking whether or not that's a requirement and thinking about whether or not you might be able to build an eligible proposal is another question to ask. Another important thing that I find critical to look at is the list of things that the grant can't be used for, because sometimes you might have a really good idea that you're already sort of working with, but the grant might not allow funding for several critical elements of the thing that you'd like to apply for. So knowing that early is really important. And I guess maybe I'll just jump to that last bullet point, which is when in doubt, either contact the funder, look for more information, because clarifying whether or not you're eligible in the first place, can save you a lot of effort if you may end up ultimately being not eligible. And so I just wanted to throw the ADRIA eligibility criteria that I found on the website up here. And James, let me know if this is all accurate, but it looks like there's basically a couple of different organizational statuses that you need to be one of them, or a consortia of organizations that at least the lead is an eligible organization type. And then you also have to have some basic forms of insurance that you can demonstrate. So pretty reasonable. I'm guessing that most of the people on this call will meet those criteria in some way, shape, or form, or would have networks that could. And so just making sure that you're aware of those upfront and making sure that you're thinking about a proposal in the context of those eligibility criteria is really important. And so if you've gotten over that hurdle, then you start thinking about this question of, is it feasible to apply? And much of our conversation today will really be about this feasibility question. And so it's really thinking about where you're thinking about going with this grant proposal and how you think you're going to get there. And so what I tend to do is first check the deadline. So if the grant deadline is, yesterday, can't apply. If it's 2 days from now and I know I have 2 full days of work and it just wouldn't be possible, there's no reason to apply, unfortunately. But checking the deadline and then taking an educated guess about how much work is actually required is a useful way of understanding the feasibility. And usually I base that on a guesstimate of, what's the total word count of what I need to write, thinking about any coordination needs that you might have, so obtaining letters or things like that, which we'll talk about more later on. And then also thinking about who needs to be in the community of people who's applying. So who you need to bring along for the ride for approvals, who you need to be in collaboration with. And if you can think about those things in a general sense, and those can match up with the deadline, then it might be feasible. And so I'll just reiterate what James said at the beginning. He just made me aware of this just before the session, so I've updated the slide. The 17th, Friday. So you've got 2 extra weeks, which is usually very welcome news when I read something like that. So thank you, James, on behalf of the listeners. So good luck with your expression of interest writing. And yes, we'll dig into the next section. So if you think you're pretty confident you're eligible and you're pretty confident that a grant writing process is feasible for you, then you want to start thinking about the eligibility criteria not the eligibility criteria, the assessment criteria. And so this is really the first and most critical step, in my opinion, about sort of conceptualizing how you're actually going to write up your idea. And so rather than talking about general topics on this area, I think I'm just going to jump straight into the assessment criteria for the VADA grant, because I think it's really important, and I think they're quite indicative of many grants that you'll see around. So at the EOI stage, which you now have a few more weeks for, first and foremost, they're checking for eligibility. And so I'll say this, James, I know I'm being very nice openly right now, but I also really like it when there are EOIs. So I'm happy that you've done the EOI process. And that's in part because, you invest a small amount of effort to check your own eligibility and check whether or not your ideas, roughly in alignment with what people are looking for. And so the EOI assessment criteria in this instance is focused on first feasibility, timeframe, and budget. demonstrating understanding of the issues. So showing that you know a bit about the topic, maybe can back up some of your claims with evidence, so ideally you do a little bit of a mini literature review and can say, oh, that research found this, or this organizational report said that. And then because this is a research program, having a clearly defined research question and having a high likelihood of actually being able to answer the research question within the framework that you set out is critical. And then lastly, is this particular EOI likely to contribute to the health and well-being of Victorians impacted by AOD-related harms? So articulating a specific type of benefit. And then also, I think it's really important at this stage, although you don't need to give deep thought to it when you're writing up the EOI, it's always good to have on the horizon the full proposal assessment criteria, because these are where really you fill out the full picture. And so having an idea of how you're going to write a full proposal, if you were successful at the EOI stage, against the assessment criteria is a really good thing to have in mind from the outset. And so just going through these one by one again. First off, alignment with ADRIA's research agenda is 25%. So definitely get to know ADRIA's research agenda and make sure that it's in alignment to the highest degree possible. I imagine, James, you can answer this maybe afterwards, but you want to align as best you can, but I imagine you don't have to be in alignment with every single nuance of the whole agenda. And so just thinking about how you can make really robust alignment very understood in your application is valuable. Next is the benefit to be derived. So I also really like how this is shaped up in that it can be broad, filling knowledge gaps, or it can be any number of other specific types of benefits, whether that's to a population or whether that's an organizational benefit. So there's lots of forms of research that you could theoretically do that would be beneficial to some part of the ecosystem that you work in. But then remember to place probably the most emphasis on your research design, because it's the highest percentage. So definitely think about that question, think about your methods, think about whether it's feasible in the scale and scope of what you're proposing. And think about whether or not you have the skills and knowledge to do those things in your project team. So although project team is a separate piece, I think design and project team are often quite closely linked. And then lastly, I put in red value for money just because I noticed that was a change from last year. And so for this year's round, it's really good to consider how you can efficiently and effectively do ethical, high quality research and show that in your writing. So thinking about those things, even when you're writing the EOI, or thinking about how you might write a full proposal that emphasizes those things while you're thinking about your EOI is really important. And also just remember to engage with all the other resources that are on the ADRIA and VADA website. So get to know the purpose of the grant, the ADRIA program, get to know the priorities, and understand how you can fit into them best. And just a quick side note on thinking about assessment criteria and sort of pre-planning for writing, getting together boilerplate items. So, pre-written documents that are, things like CVs for key staff members and keeping those relatively up to date, keeping a couple of statements of capability or descriptions of your organization or your programs might be really valuable to have around. And then also just information about your liability or public indemnity insurance that's also up to date. Having all those things in a folder somewhere, relatively up to date, can really help speed up the process of getting together some of the pieces of your grant. And so, yeah, just a little side note to try and build up that knowledge resource if you don't already have it within your organization. All right, so jumping to the largest portion of this presentation, thinking about the writing process. And it'll basically be broken up into two sections, sort of planning for writing and then doing the writing. So before you write, you want to develop your ideas. And if you have a pre-existing idea, that's great. If you bring an existing idea to the table, what you really need to do is then have a deep think about how that idea actually maps onto the opportunity at hand, because oftentimes there's overlap, but there's not complete overlap. And so you need to think about what pieces of your original idea that you're bringing fit in with this opportunity and what might need to be changed. Because sometimes when you bring a pre-existing idea, there are parts that just aren't quite compliant or stick to the requirements. And so, yeah, so a good example of that might be size and scope. So you might have a really grand idea for a really big research project, but you might see that, you know, a particular opportunity only really would fund a pilot or a proof of concept for something. And so you could still make incremental progress towards your ambition, but you might need to tailor it to the opportunity a little bit. But you shouldn't worry if you don't have an idea. If you think there's an opportunity there, you think you're eligible, you think it's feasible, and you'd like to pursue it for any number of reasons, there's lots of ways to generate ideas. So speaking with colleagues inside and outside your organization, looking at previous proposals if you can find them from your organization, whether they're successful or not. Oftentimes there's good ideas just waiting around for the right opportunity. And so, yeah, repurposing an idea that might not have been successful for another, you know, more competitive opportunity might be, you know, one really great way to, you know, source an idea that needs doing. I often find doing a bit of reading around a topic, especially if it's a topic that I need to, you know, catch up on. It's an excuse to do reading that I've been putting off anyways, but it helps knock loose some ideas for me. And I'll do a full session for the full proposal stage on doing evidence reviews. And so we can talk a bit more about that either in the question and answer session today, but definitely more in the session next year. I also find that visual methods can be really important, especially in that knowledge gap filling kind of space. So if you know that there's a new dynamic in a field, or if, you know, so for instance, if there's a new, you know, substance entering the Victorian community that's, you know, really changing the dynamics, you know, visual methods or trying to make systems maps or something else visual can help develop ideas. If you have the kernel of an idea, sometimes I find actually developing a program logic, so thinking about how a program might be implemented, can actually create sort of a table into which you can put in all the different pieces of an idea for a program. And there's a link there for an ACE resource that I think is really good on building program logics, but we can talk about that more at the end if you'd like as well. And then the last two things are talking to frontline staff. So if you're not in a position to work with clients every day, I think, especially in the organizations like the ones that you all work in, speaking to the people who are talking to clients on a very regular basis is a very rich source to understand what really needs thinking about or doing in the research space. And lastly, sometimes just writing generally, just doing basic forms of writing helps me sometimes get ideas flowing. And so a couple of other key questions to help you develop your ideas. First question is, are all the relevant people in the room for putting together what you're trying to put together and agreeing to do it? So, you know, do you have support from senior management? Do you have all the operational groups from your organization? Do you have every community organization or any connection to country that needs to be navigated as well? You know, are you talking to everybody that needs talking to early in the process and conceptualizing this in a way that's maximally beneficial? Do you need someone's approval to apply? Like I said, so senior management being aware of something and knowing that you're going to actually apply and making sure that it can be approved if you're going to develop it. And then also, will you involve other organizations? So thinking about any of those external parties outside of your organization is really critical as well. However, I will note, I say in that bullet point, it's very often to have all the external parties involved as early as humanly possible. However, sometimes you need to get an initial idea together. So there are instances where, you know, your organization can only participate if there's a few key parameters. And so putting together an initial idea and then sharing that initial idea with colleagues is a great way to kind of navigate that, making sure people are in at the ground floor, but you're still able to take forward an idea that actually is feasible for you to take forward. So before you write, I encourage you to make a plan. It's not always feasible, but planning your writing, especially if it's a larger grant, can be really critical. So usually that should start with thinking about who your audience is, the purpose of the grant, and any strategic information that you need to know. And I'll talk a little bit about getting to know the funder later, but thinking about your audience, and usually that's the funder, is really important. Then also take a closer look at the application form. So doing that regularly and making sure that you understand what you're actually meant to be doing, what the boxes are that you're filling in. And sometimes that means that you need to log into an online portal. Sometimes it means downloading a file and having a look. I think that's how the EOI works, at least for ADRIA. Have a look, understand if there are word limits, how many questions need responding to, what the nature of those questions are, and use that as a tool for your planning. And then when you're thinking about what you're actually going to write, there was a Tasmanian government website that provided this fairly useful step-by-step guide that lots of others have mentioned, but yeah, just go through the what, why, who, how, and when. So first, define your project, be specific, figure out for you what's in scope for the project, you and your collaborators, and what's not. Identify the needs that you're addressing. So provide a really clear problem statement and justification for why you think it's important to do what you want to do. Clearly articulate who would be involved and what they would be doing. And then define the process. So be really clear about achievable means by which you can answer those how and when questions. And so when you're thinking about those things, keep all those things in mind as you're developing a writing plan. And then a couple last things about the actual writing process to consider before you actually begin the process. First is, if multiple people are going to contribute to the writing, I know this is really basic, but figure out who's going to do what and actually delegate the labor, because sometimes it's unclear in groups, who's going to write that section, who's going to write this. And try and do that based on people's content area knowledge or their expertise or their skill level or their willingness to do the writing, and delegate labor appropriately in your group, and you'll progress more smoothly. Also consider where the time-intensive sections of the writing are, and weigh that time intensity versus how important that section is. So think about how much labor is involved in a section and how critical it is to your success, and then make a plan that takes into account those things. And then if you're lucky enough to have enough time, think about including any of the following in the process. So not only writing, but rewriting. Definitely make sure to proofread. But also think about including time for external people to provide some feedback. So if you have critical colleagues who can provide insights into strengthening your proposal, that's usually valuable. And then also considering having one person who's responsible for the final product. So once the whole product is together, have one person do a final pass and try and make the whole item in one voice if that's feasible. Because having a continuity of style and consistency across the document can really strengthen a proposal. And then I guess other parts of the planning process outside of the writing are just thinking about what other things need doing that will supplement your writing. So do you need support from letters of support from collaborators? If yes, get those going as soon as possible. If you need other documentation, get those going as soon as possible. Basically anything that you don't have complete control over when and how they'll be produced, good to start early. Because sometimes they can take a really long time. So, getting sign-offs on certain things in my world sometimes takes a few weeks. And so depends on the thing, but it's important. Okay, so Moving to the actual writing process, these comments are really a blend about just sort of broad thoughts on good writing, that many of them are just basics, and then also thoughts specific to grant writing as well. So some of the basics that are worth considering and getting right are, first, just using direct and clear language. Often that means using active voice, and avoiding jargon where possible. So I imagine in your field, sometimes there are certain ways of saying things or terminology that you just can't avoid, that are slightly complicated, that only people in the field would know. But overall, you should really seek to write in a way that anybody could understand, because the simpler and more direct is usually the best understood, especially in a grant writing context. And I think it's really good to sometimes test your assumption of whether or not you're writing in a clear and direct way. And so if you have somebody who knows nothing about your topic, if you have an auntie or an uncle who just know, you can share that writing with and see whether or not it makes sense to them, that's a really great way to just test that. Another key basic in the grant writing context is following the directions. And I'll say this a few more times, but especially in relation to word limits, but generally with the requirements of the grant. I have to admit, on one or two occasions in my grant writing life, I've put a lot of effort into a grant, but I didn't follow the requirements perfectly, and those grants were less likely to be successful. Occasionally I've gotten lucky and they've forgiven me, but it happens. Actually, on a personal note, I actually was turned down I applied for a writing composition role when I was in graduate school the first time, and my cover letter had 3 typos. And so making those sorts of little mistakes can actually really get in the way. I didn't get the job that year. I got the job the next year when I didn't have the typos in my cover letter. So following directions, considering things like making sure that spelling and grammar are taken care of in your application, really important. Also, I'd encourage you not to be intimidated by the funder's jargon. So if there is technical language, or there are discussions of log frames or objectives or outputs or outcomes or impacts, and you don't quite know where the line is between outputs and outcomes and impacts, don't worry. There's lots of resources available on the internet. There's lots of people who speak fluent program logic. And so if that's the only thing in your way, and otherwise you want to write this grant, you have a great idea, be bold and pursue it, because there's definitely ways to overcome any knowledge barriers there. And then again, be specific. So just to reiterate, answer those key questions. If you write a grant proposal that tells the reader clearly what you want to do, when and how you want to do it, and why it matters and what the benefit is, you've gone a long way. So that's good. A couple of other approaches to writing that I just want to emphasize. With grants, I think using the funnel approach, so going from broad to specific, especially when you're thinking about a literature review or a problem statement, when you're trying to sort of build towards the justification of why you want to do the specific thing that you do, you should really work towards the wider context, and then sort of take the reader on a journey towards that specific idea that you're working towards. Also, just make sure that in your writing things line up closely. So if you say you want to do activity X, make sure that you describe that it results in outcome Y. So, put those two things close together in the writing. So I want to do this because it will result in that kind of structure, so that it's really clear to the reader. Because at the end of the day, the people reading these will be reading a lot of applications. And so you just want to make sure that they know exactly what you're trying to do and how you think that's going to work. Because it's a research grant, you should definitely think a lot about your research design. And so a couple of ways to do that in terms of practical writing are, first, looking at the research in the field and having a look to see what might be an incremental step in methodological terms or in learning or knowledge terms. And so one of the things that I advise people to do is, if you can find a really good quality systematic review on what you're thinking about, and have a look at the, what's the next research that the authors of that systematic review say should be done, And your idea is one of those things. You're probably on the right track. And also looking at the methodologies that are included in the papers in that review or in other journal articles or reports that describe their methodologies. Yeah, having a look at what contemporary approaches are to doing the research that you want to do, I think is really important. You can adapt approaches also that have been used elsewhere. So you might have an idea to do some research about something that's been used in New Zealand and something that's been used in the US, but hasn't been tried in the Victorian context yet. And so looking at the documentation for those uses in other places and then trying to adapt it to the local context is another way to approach that. And then maybe the last comment about sort of writing up a design or a methodology is seek help if you don't feel confident. There's lots of ways to gather information on that. And in reference to my previous presentation about university partnerships, I think, reaching out to knowledge sector colleagues is a great way to efficiently move through that methodology question. And then lastly, I think on this slide, I really want to emphasize, make sure that you clearly describe the benefits of what you're proposing. And this is critical for several reasons. First, because you want to be realistic about the benefits that you're going to provide, right? So you want to be ambitious about benefits and articulate them clearly, but you also don't want to overstate them. So for instance, if you're doing certain types of research, you might not actually benefit the people who you're doing the research with, but your learning might benefit people like them 2 years from now. And so if that's the case, saying that clearly is often a very reasonable thing to say, and it's a really valuable thing, because there are certain types of research that might not be directly beneficial to the individuals who you're talking to. And so being realistic but ambitious about the benefits, I think, is the way I would frame things. And then also thinking thoroughly about this benefits question is really important for if you're going to be funded ultimately for this grant anyways, because you'll likely need to do an ethics application for most of the things that you'll apply for. But knowing how to talk about those benefits, as well as the risks that come along with the research now, is good. This slide is really a bit about some approaches to writing that I think are valuable. And so I'll just run through the list and keen to talk about them if you want at the end. But first is kind of telling a story. So if it's possible within the structure of the grant to kind of weave a narrative or create a storytelling vibe or provide illustrative cases where possible, giving the reader something to hold on to and remember from your application outside of the general idea can be really powerful. Again, speaking the language of the funder. So if you review their principles and priorities and are able to align the way that you write to a certain degree with the way that they write or the language that they use, it makes it much more likely that the funder will be able to see your project within the framework that they're working with. Also, potentially showing how you might differentiate yourself from other applicants. So you might have a unique thing that your organization does. And so showing how you provide real value and how you might differentiate yourself from the community of other applicants might be another way to use strategy in your writing. Also, I guess I'll touch on the evidence point and the credibility point, 2 dots down at the same time. So providing backing for any claims that you make if possible. So, if you make a claim about a fact, providing where you found that fact, whether it's a report or a journal article or elsewhere, and showing that you sort of know the evidence on a topic can be very powerful, both to show your credibility, but also that your reasoning is really sound for why you want to do what you want to do. Excuse me. And then also, I think alongside that, another thing that builds your credibility quite significantly is demonstrating your knowledge of how the sector is currently shaped. And so showing how your proposal might support or add to or complement previous work. So showing that golden thread between what you're putting forward and previous things that have happened either in your organization or in the wider sector can be a really useful way to frame up your writing. And then lastly, where possible, using design elements can often be really effective to supplement your writing. So it's not the writing itself, but using clear visual structure to show the reader what's most important, whether that's bullet points or numbered lists, or whether that's using, imagery or design elements where required, can be very helpful. Though, a side note, generating images can also be quite time consuming, so you need to weigh up that trade-off in certain circumstances. And then lastly, a couple of writing process tips to consider. First off, if you're writing in a group, consider appointing one member to kind of project manage the process. So set some internal deadlines and have one person be responsible for checking in whether or not we're hitting the internal deadline, so that you have a smooth and non-chaotic writing process at the end. And then, like I said earlier, if it's possible within your writing process, having one person who's ultimately responsible for the style and voice of the application can be really helpful for some grants. And then similarly, like I said before, making sure that somebody with fresh eyes can have a look and just double check what you're putting forward can also be really helpful. And then lastly, this is a small but really important detail. I find very frequently, especially with more complicated grants, that little parts of the program change towards the end as you're refining what you're putting forward. And making sure that you double check the whole application for consistency. So, did we say phase 3 is going to last 2 weeks here, and then elsewhere in the document it's going to be 4 weeks? Making sure that everything lines up in the finished product is really important. Okay, so moving to a couple of sort of closing small topics. First off, seeking support. So we talked about university collaborations and knowledge sector collaborations in the last webinar, which I strongly encourage you to seek out if you haven't already, because I think, collaboration across sectors is really valuable. And I think these quotes were from last year's applications, but last year, the ADRIA program said applications for collaborative projects were strongly encouraged, and it seems like that's still the case. And so, I'd say generally where you have scope in grant writing more broadly for collaboration, whether that's internal to your organization or with other organizations, usually strengthens the process, especially if you have a good project management approach to incorporate everybody's ideas. And then the other thing to say is that, again, you're not alone and everything is feasible to do if you really want to pursue it. So if you don't know answers to questions, do you have people in your networks who know the answers to those questions? If you're worried about your grant writing or research skills, do you have people in your organization or your networks who have some of the skills that you might lack? Don't be a stranger to frequently asked questions pages. Oftentimes those have a lot of answers. Attending sessions like this, as well as question and answer sessions associated with grants, is really important. And also with big government grants, oftentimes there's documents that are produced after those meetings that describe all the questions asked. And oftentimes, if you have a question, somebody else has the same one. So getting across all those different resources to answer your questions and fill your knowledge needs can help you have a successful process. Jumping over to a few thoughts on budgets, and this is not a budgeting session, but it's important to think about the budget in relation to your application. And so again, the headline is follow directions. Oftentimes funders will have a template, and so use the definitions they use and use the directions they provide you, because at the end of the day, you need a compliant budget first, and then after that, they'll evaluate the merits of it. A bit of advice from my perspective is that, of course, stay below the maximum allowed. You don't want to apply for more than is allowable because they won't fund it, because they state the maximum for a reason. But also don't be shy about asking for what's appropriate. And I guess I mean that to say both big or small. So if you have an idea that really pushes right up against that maximum and it's clearly justifiable, don't be shy about asking that, because if they say there's a maximum, that means that's the maximum they'll fund for an individual project. At the same time, if you know that you're making a fairly modest request, make a reasonable, modest budget. You don't have to undersell the budget, but have it be appropriate for what you're actually putting forward. So just being realistic about costs. I think is a great way to think about budgets, because funders usually know what things cost, especially if you're looking at sort of state level funding here in Victoria. So also, if you don't know what something's cost, again, there are resources out there. You can call a supplier to get a quote for a thing. You can ask others who have obtained that service or that material before. Another thing to consider is just whether or not you're budgeting inclusive or exclusive of GST, because sometimes that comes up in where the maximum is. Sometimes funders put out, a maximum figure, but they don't tell you, they don't clarify, is this inclusive, is this exclusive of GST? And I know that I've been in organizations where it's been unclear, whether or not we need to apply it. And lastly, ask questions of everybody who knows about budgets. So I'm not all that great at budgets, but I have finance colleagues who are really good at it. So I just ask them questions, and they're, they make my life so much easier and joyful. So again, all you have to do is ask. As I said, another thing to consider is knowing your audience. So learning about the funder as well as maybe previous rounds of funding can be really helpful in writing a successful proposal. And so reading about the organizational history, what their vision or mission might be, what just general things about the organization and their values and their principles and what drives them, over and above maybe the specific documentation related to the grant, can be helpful to frame up your value proposition and to figure out what benefits you might want to foreground. If it's possible to find out what's been funded in previous rounds, that can often be a really good sort of indicator of where your proposal might land in things. And so having a look at those resources, if they're available, is always valuable in my opinion. And then when you know those things about your audience, show how your proposed ideas align with that organization. Demonstrate to them, your shared values and purpose. So if your organization and their organization have similar values and purpose, make that really clear in your proposal. Also, if you have any previous connections, if another organizational group in your organization ran a successful grant a couple years ago, funded by that organization, mention it, because that's usually valuable. And then, of course, if you're looking back at previous grants, have a look at how those grants were written. Were they really matter of fact? Did they tell a story? And you can try and align some of your writing with successful grant approaches. That's often a good way. And so, last slide of the day. What are my key takeaways from this gigantic amount of information that I've just shared with you? First, ask yourself why you're applying for this grant and find your reason, because having a good reason is always important for driving a process. If you have a good reason and you're eligible, try and make a feasible plan. So think about that planning process if you have time. Follow directions is the true headline for all grant writing processes, in my opinion. Check and double check your directions. Don't be shy about getting support, especially in relation to developing research methodologies, for proofreading, or even for thinking about how you're actually going to implement the work. It's just nice to work with people. And lastly, make sure to show the funder in your writing that what you're trying to do is feasible, innovative, valuable, evidence-informed, all those things that we mentioned. So really show it through your writing. And also show that your organization, your collaborators, and you yourself are credible and knowledgeable on the topic. And also that you anticipate a realistic benefit from what you're applying for. And with that, I'll just say, good luck and happy writing. And thanks for joining me. And I'd love to discuss any questions you might have at this time.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I did forget to say at the start that we can take questions. Please put them into the chat. Otherwise, I can... Yeah, I've run this as a webinar, so I can't remember how to... Oh, the chat or the Q&A, either doesn't matter. Attendees. Oh, yeah, I can also allow you to talk if you want to talk. While you're preparing your questions, I will just note a couple of things. One, thing that occurred to me when Paul was saying, if you've already got an idea, that's great, and you can. You don't have to develop one, which is a really good point. One great thing you can do is just ask an academic, if you know an academic, if it's a good idea, or someone who's in a research position in a different organization. You can just ask them if it's a good idea. Academics and researchers love getting emails generally, unless they're a dean or a VC or something. They're probably happy to answer a quick question, and you link them to the ADRIA website and say, hey, I was thinking of doing this and this is my idea, and what do you think? Do you think it's feasible? And they'll give you a really good answer, because every year the quality of ADRIA grants is really, really high, but you do get some odd, one or two odd applications that might be a great idea, but they're just not suitable for an ADRIA grant. So, you always get those, or you always get one of those, we find. And a good way to avoid that is just asking someone who, an academic, something like that. They'll be able to tell you pretty quickly if there's rough alignment, or if this is a good idea or not. Don't have any questions so far. It can be a bit overwhelming to put your hand up at these things, but please feel free to jump in if you have one.
And no worries if not.
Yeah.
I'll also, I guess I put my contact information up there, and if you don't know an academic in your field, I'm not an expert in this area, but at the risk of making a dangerous claim, I'm also happy to be a thinking partner on occasion if you all just need somebody to bounce methodology ideas off of. So happy to be contacted, and I'll let you know if I'm super busy or not as soon as I get the message.
All right, well, no questions are coming through. If you do have questions, please email me or Paul with them. Me, obviously, for detailed ADRIA specific programmatic questions, I'll be able to answer those. Paul can probably, can bounce some ideas, or, answer those questions.
Offer methodology, but not deep AOD expertise.
Or ADRIA, very ADRIA specific. I'll be able to answer ones about eligibility criteria and what our approach is to X, Y, and Z. James took lots of notes. That's great, James. Thanks for that. So feel free to get in touch if you need to, and just remember that the EOI submission date has been extended by 2 weeks, so it's now close of business on the 17th of November, so that's Friday. And look forward to hearing from you. Thanks again, Paul. It was really great, as always.
Thank you, and good to see you all.
Yeah, you too.